Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I've got 12:02, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for spending your lunch hour with us to hear about the riveting 2026 Missouri legislative session. We're going to talk about what happened with legislation, with the budget, and what might be coming next. So I am Kathy Brown. I am going to be your speaker for today, and we're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So this session will be recorded and is going to be provided to people who registered and potentially elsewhere. You are muted, so you'll have to use some of the other functions to communicate during our time together. You can turn on your own closed captioning on your screen down below. And don't be shy. I can't see you. I am literally speaking to my own face on a screen, which is so strange. So if you hear something you like or something you don't like, or you have a question, please feel free to participate by using the reaction buttons at the bottom of your screen and entering any questions into the Q&A. We have dedicated time at the end of our time together for questions. As you think of them, feel free to drop them in and we will get to them all at the very end of our time together. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to go over kind of the process of the making of the laws in Missouri. So we're going to talk about how a bill becomes a law in the Missouri General Assembly, and we're going to talk about the budget process. So they have some similarities and some differences. And we're going to talk about those processes, not necessarily because it's so important that everybody on this call can do a how a bill becomes a law like you had to do in fourth grade, but it's really to understand what a long and extensive process it is and how many people have influence over the course of the process developing statutory language, legislation, as well as making the budget. We're going to talk specifically about what happened during this legislative session, what didn't happen, and what might be coming next. And then, like I said, we'll give some time for questions at the end. So we'll start with this. And if this is very small on your screen or you can't read these words, that's okay. I'm going to talk through it at a pretty high level, and we're going to send out the slides to anybody who requests them. This graphic can also be found on the House and Senate website, house.mo.gov and senate.mo.gov, where you can take a deeper dive into the process of how a bill becomes a law. So in the Missouri General Assembly, we have two bodies, the House and the Senate. The House has 163 members and the Senate has 34. Each of you as Missourians has a House member called your representative and a senator that represent you. In some small cases, a seat might be vacant, so you might be missing one of those, but there are a few vacancies on the House side right now. Each member of those bodies has the opportunity to propose legislation in the form of a bill. And when it's proposed by your representative on the House side, it's called a House bill, you'll always know that it came from the House of Representatives because before the number that it's assigned, it'll say HB, which stands for House bill. And in the case of a Senate bill, the letters SB will be in front of the number as well. So we'll start with a bill filed in the House. They are filed and they are numbered chronologically as filed. So if I am a representative and I am the first person to pre-file a bill, which can begin in December, then my number might be quite low. If I'm a representative and I am the last person to file a bill on the last day that you're allowed to file a bill, my House bill number might be House Bill 925 as opposed to House Bill 17 or 18 or 19 that comes early on. So legislation is filed. So even the number of the bill can tell you a little bit something about it. And typically what happens is senators and representatives file bills early that are most important to them. So you will rarely see a legislator file a bill on the last day of filing, just at the nick of time when it's a very, very high priority. So once a bill is filed, then it is given a number and it's moved through a little bit of a process before it gets assigned to a committee. So these committees in the House and the Senate are topical. So you might have a healthcare committee, you might have an education committee, you have a variety of committees, and that legislation will be assigned to a committee. It's up to that committee and the committee chair particularly whether or not the bill moves on to the next step in that committee process, which is to have a hearing. Every bill that moves through the committee process has a public hearing, and that's an opportunity for people to either come in person and provide their perspective on the legislation, and also testify in front of the committee for the bill, against the bill, or for informational purposes. And in some committees and in some sessions, you can also provide that testimony in writing with some forms on the House website. If the bill is supported by members of the committee, then it moves forward for a vote, and then it goes on to the next step. After it comes out of committee, then it has to be voted on by the entire body. So every one of those 163 members of the House or 34 members of the Senate get to talk about that bill, debate its merits, and decide whether or not they would like to vote to move it forward. If they do move it forward, then it has to go through that same process all over again in the opposite house. So every House bill that moves its way through committee, through the entire House of Representatives, then has to go on to the Senate and has to be assigned to a committee, has to be voted out of committee, has to go to the full Senate for a positive vote. And if all of those things happen, but something was changed in the opposite body, it has to go back to the body of origin so that those changes can be approved. In the event that the changes are not approved and they reject the changes of the opposite body, then it goes to a different kind of committee called a conference committee made up of House members and Senate members who kind of hash out the differences. Then it has to go back again for a vote of those two bodies. So if you're asking yourself, this is our process, how in the world does anything ever get done? I'll show you on the next slide, it rarely does. So this legislative session particularly, some of the stats you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen, in the Senate, our 34 senators filed 975 unique pieces of legislation. 58 Senate joint resolutions, 16 Senate resolutions, and 13 Senate concurrent resolutions. A joint resolution is primarily used to amend the Missouri Constitution or submit a constitutional question to voters. And a concurrent resolution just kind of expresses the position or intent of the legislature, but it doesn't create law. So neither of those things go to the governor for their signature like pieces of legislation do. And on the House side, our 163 House members filed 1,924 bills, 98 House joint resolutions, 33 concurrent resolutions, and 28 House resolutions. So quite a few pieces of legislation filed for the Missouri General Assembly. And I don't think I mentioned this in terms of the process prior, but the Missouri General Assembly, although they can pre-file in December, session doesn't start until January and it ends in May. So consideration of every single piece of legislation that was filed is impossible just because of the constraints of time. Now, every year, those bills can be refiled, but if they are not passed during the year that they're filed, they start at the process the very, very beginning. So it doesn't matter if a piece of legislation gets all the way to a final vote in the opposite body with the language from the body of origin and is one vote away from being at the governor's desk. If that doesn't happen, it starts all over next legislative session. It gets a new number, has to be assigned a committee, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a long process, complicated process. There are a lot of things involved. So this legislative session, 100 of those bills total were passed by the Missouri General Assembly, which actually is quite a few given their recent history. So you can see some of the 2020 to 2025 passage rates of legislation from the Missouri General Assembly. They hit an all-time low in 2024. 2025 saw only 49 pieces of legislation passed. So this General Assembly was working quite a bit quicker in passing legislation than previous General Assemblies. You can see of those 100, 58 of those were House bills. There was one House joint resolution, it's kind of a big one, so we're going to talk about it a little bit. 38 Senate bills, one Senate concurrent resolution, two Senate joint resolution, and 17 of those 100 were budget bills. So those budget bills spend more than $50 billion and determine where all of that money goes across the state. So that's about a 3% passage rate. So I would argue that anybody who engages in the legislative process in the state of Missouri is truly an optimist, because from the gate, there's about a 3% chance you're going to cross the finish line, yet people do it over and over and over every year for things that they care very deeply about. So next, we're going to look at some of the things that relate to individuals with disabilities, what passed and what didn't pass this legislative session. And then after we talk about some of the legislation that went through, we're going to talk a little bit more about what happened during the budget process. So this is kind of small, I realize, but some of the bills that were truly agreed and finally passed, which is what they call it when legislation has gone through the entire process and has been delivered to the governor's office for his signature. Was voted positively in both the House and the Senate. They agreed to the differences. Start with the first one. There were many pieces of legislation filed. Of those thousands of pieces of legislation, they can be duplicative. So, Senator Kathy Brown might want to file a bill making the potato Missouri state vegetable, and 10 other senators might do that as well. So some of those could be duplicates. But this particular bill establishes the Act Against Abusive Website Access Litigation, which established provisions relating to litigation among certain disability access violations. And this really specifically had to do with ADA lawsuits for website accessibility, and some of the very high number of suits that were being brought by plaintiffs who were filing a large number of these lawsuits, primarily to encourage those entities they were suing to settle. So this legislation was really pretty widely supported and non-controversial and went forward. A couple of others of interest, House Bill 1827 adds occupational therapists to the definition of other authorized healthcare providers. For the purposes of a physician statement required for disabled license plates and placards. So previously, the attestation of an occupational therapist was not enough to get someone an accessible parking hang tag or license plates that allowed people to take advantage of accessible parking opportunities. House Bill 1840. So this is kind of an interesting one. This is a piece of legislation that many people who work in legislation will call an omnibus bill. So one of the things that happens throughout that long process as time gets shorter and shorter and shorter is that people start looking for other people's legislation to attach their idea to. So somebody might say, God, that state potato thing, that's not going anywhere. But there's a farm bill that looks like it's just about to pass, and it might be germane to that topic. So I'm going to amend it, and I'm going to include my legislation on this bigger piece of legislation. There was a piece of legislation that had 47 amendments done to it. It, shot up to 177 pages. And that all happened during one session on the House floor because time was getting short and everybody wanted to get their legislation on something that was moving. So it made it more likely that it would cross the finish line. House Bill 1840 was one of those bills. So it contained many provisions and many provisions beyond the ones I mentioned. But of interest to the disability community might be that it lifts the cap on grants provided by the Missouri Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing for communication access, and it enhances their ability to fund communication services, particularly for folks who are deaf and blind. That is something that community was advocating strongly for, and there was just a dollar limit in statute that said it couldn't be more than $300,000. We know the need is greater than that. There were requests greater than that, so that lifted that cap for them, solved a real problem. Also included in House Bill 1840, Mason's Law, which allows people to apply for a designation that lets law enforcement know that they may have difficulty communicating. So the details on, how you're going to be able to do that and when you're going to be able to do that, assuming this bill gets signed, will come out eventually. But, if you envision someone who is, deaf or hard of hearing getting pulled over in a traffic stop, and the law enforcement officer not understanding that they can't hear what they're saying and thinking that they're not following orders or directions. What will happen if they have applied for this and have this designation in the system is when they bring their license back and they run it, then something will pop up saying this person may have difficulty communicating, etc. So that is a really nice protective feature for individuals with communication differences. Also included in House Bill 1840, something called RJ's Law, which creates a purple alert system to aid in the identification and location of missing persons with developmental disabilities. So think of this like the silver alert system or the amber alert system, where you can very widely, rapidly, and consistently communicate related to a missing person with a developmental disability who may be in danger or may need assistance. So those were great things in that bill for the disability community. And there were lots of other pieces in that legislation as well. There was another bill, omnibus healthcare bill, that included a variety of things, including it eliminated the sunset on the Ticket to Work health assurance program. So some of you might be aware of that program. It's an opportunity for individuals with disabilities to work, earn money, retain some benefits, and it included a sunset, which sometimes happens when legislation is passed originally. They say, okay, we're going to do it, but then it's going to sunset in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And that was coming up, that date was coming up, so that was eliminated. It increases disabled placards for cars expiration date from 4 years to 8 years. So, that just lessens the number of times that a person has to get that renewed and deal with the good old DMV to, again, explain that their lifelong disability has of yet to be cured, and they still do need access to the accessibility that is provided. It allows the state to seek a waiver to participate in the Food as Medicine program, which isn't really a disability specific program, but it is something which would allow for medically tailored nutrition programs and prescription for healthy food. And so we know that access to adequate nutrition and diverse menu options and medically prescribed nutrition is sometimes important to individuals with disabilities and their families. And it allows supervision from an SLP in good standing. That changes a provision which previously required the supervisor to be licensed in Missouri. So this was something that the speech language pathologists had been working on in order to increase access to licensed supervisors for new SLPs coming into the field. So those are a few things that happened that kind of touched the world of people with disabilities and their families, and I'm sure there were many others. Legislative session ended on Friday, and it is likely that there is some language somewhere in some bill that was passed that's also maybe 177 pages, and we just haven't seen it yet, or it was a last minute amendment. So there may be additional information coming out about things that were done or things that may impact this community. So let's talk about a couple things that did not pass. And I'm not being morbid, that's what people call it. When a piece of legislation doesn't pass in the session, it dies. It dies at various places throughout that process, right? So a piece of legislation can die in committee. It can die in committee because the committee chair just doesn't move it forward. It can die in committee because the committee votes it down and says, we don't like this legislation, therefore it can't move on to the next step in the process. Or it just doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves because there are other things that are taking up a lot of space, time, and attention with the Missouri General Assembly. So there was a piece of legislation filed by Senator Schnelting that modified the offense of abuse of elderly, disabled, or vulnerable persons, changing those offenses and from a misdemeanor to a felony. That passed out of a committee called Senate General Laws and just didn't move any farther. We have House Bill 2304, which establishes a written parental consent requirement for IEPs. That was voted to pass out of its House committees, and the language was also added to House Bill 2426, which passed the House. So this was the priority of a wonderful organization called MODE, Missouri Disability Empowerment. A lot of parents were pursuing this requirement for consent for IEPs. The fact that the language was amended on the floor and passed in the House is of great advantage to this concept next year because legislators have already had an opportunity to vote on it. So, it's very easy to go to legislators and say, well, you voted on this last year and you voted yes. Remember, you liked it. So let's move it along a little bit faster. Another piece of legislation, House Bill 2989. So this isn't necessarily a disability-related piece of legislation, but this is related to gaming and particularly video lottery terminals. So you may or may not ever have seen these in your local gas stations. There was an effort to wrap some structure and oversight around these machines called gray machines because they kind of operate in this gray area of the law. But the exciting thing for the disability community was that a representative from the Springfield area, Representative Melanie Stinnett, added an amendment to this legislation that would have placed a fee on all of these machines and created a new fund called the Developmental Disability Community Support Fund, which would have provided funding for ongoing learning, education, and support of individuals with developmental disabilities. So dedicated funding, increased revenue to serve folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Now, this bill was killed in a Senate committee. It didn't, die a death of we ignored it. It was actually voted down in committee. So ended up being a little bit more controversial than anticipated, but sometimes there are things for people with disabilities, their families, and those who provide services to them that get connected to issues that we don't know anything about and we typically wouldn't care about. And that's what's kind of interesting about the legislative process. Another thing that kind of, started out as a very top priority, even, prior to legislative session beginning, there was a special committee on property tax reform that went all around the state holding hearings, listening to property owners, citizens, local officials related to issues of property tax. There was a lot of legislation filed that would have done a lot of different things related to property tax reform, and they ended up really not doing any of it. This is connected to us in part because some services that people with disabilities receive are funded through local tax levies on property tax, and that money goes to entities called SB 40 boards that fund local disability related services. So there were a lot of people who were very interested in what the General Assembly was going to do related to property taxes because it could have potentially impacted the funding that was raised locally to provide some of those services. This is just for fun. Here are some other things the Missouri General Assembly did. April 22nd, now as long as this legislation is signed by the governor, April 22nd is now Missouri Black Bear Awareness Day. The smooth chanterelle mushroom is now the official state mushroom. So my potato thing was not an example totally outside the realm of possibility, although we would likely never choose a potato. I didn't know what a smooth chanterelle was until I looked at this legislation, and it's quite a cute mushroom, to be honest. It doesn't look anything like that one. The city of Dexter is selected as the Rib City. Kansas City is the official barbecue capital of the state of Missouri, and as a born and raised St. Louis, and I take issue with that, but what's done is done. We have a new cowbell capital, and We will likely say goodbye to the Kansas City Chiefs as our official professional football team in the state of Missouri. So all of these provisions were part of a larger piece of legislation that did other stuff too that was kind of similar, named roads and bridges in memoriam for people who have passed or law enforcement officials. So there's always typically sometimes a bill that takes on some naming and awareness days and months. Okay, here's some other stuff that they did that's real and probably matters to us. That's all real, but it probably matters less to us unless you live in Dexter, Missouri's New Rib City. Um, HJR 173 and 174. This is the House Joint Resolution that was passed. And this was actually a priority of the governor, who stated it was a priority prior to the beginning of legislative session. Upon voter approval, this constitutional amendment requires the General Assembly to reduce and eventually eliminate the state income tax. It provides the General Assembly authority for the expansion of sales tax on transactions involving any goods and services. This could be, and it does that. I'm giving you a very high level summary. So the HJR that actually passed is a little bit different than what was initially proposed. It actually has some triggers, and it kind of corrals the General Assembly's ability to tax. So it doesn't give them authority into infinity to apply new taxes to goods and services, but it does for a period of time. And it sets certain triggers for the reduction and eventual elimination of that individual income tax. So this could be on the August or November ballot. We don't know yet. I believe the governor has until maybe the end of this week to officially decide. So he gets to decide, but there's a time limit because you have to get ready for an election, and August is right around the corner. So Missourians will be voting one way or another on this provision, which is not uncontroversial. There has been a lawsuit filed claiming that this constitutional amendment would deal with more than one part of the Constitution, which isn't allowed. So there is a legal challenge to that. And you probably can't see all of the detail in the graphic just to the right of the slide. But this shows you where Missouri gets all of its revenue from, all the income that the Missouri General Assembly then spends, right? That's called revenue. So the big blue Pac-Man looking chunk, that's individual income tax. So a lot of the consternation around the proposal is, wow, that's like 60% of the revenue that the state brings in to spend on things like services for people with disabilities, education, etc. How are we going to make all of that up? Right. So you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, as all sides of that issue kind of roll out their cases to the Missouri voters and try to convince you that their position is the correct position. So more on that will be coming, no doubt. But speaking of money, onto the budget. This image shows you two gentlemen looking just as happy as clams in mud. The one on the left is the chair of the House Budget Committee, and the one on the right is the new chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So this was his first year in that role. These are the two most important people when it comes to making the state's budget. So they have committees, subcommittees in the House, people that look at all of these issues. They have an incredible amount of power when it comes to determining whose proposals move forward throughout the process. Just kind of as a reminder of an overview of the funding structure, particularly for a lot of the services that we provide at Easterseals and a lot of the services that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities access. So they're mostly Medicaid funded, and Medicaid is a state and federal partnership. So the state puts 35 cents on the table and the federal government slaps down another 65. Now there are all kinds of rules that's we have to follow so that we can get that 65, but it's a state and federal partnership. So we put in about 35% of the dollars and the state puts in about 65. That can vary by program, or if something is particularly being incentivized, or if there's a new program where we start out with a higher federal match. But overall, generally, that's about how it goes when you're talking about Medicaid state federal match. The General Assembly decides how much money there is in the state share for that program. And then the state contracts with providers to provide services if they're not self-directed. If they're self-directed, then there is no provider involved in the provision of those services. And then families choose which provider they want to provide those services. So the state budget process is not that dissimilar to the legislative process in that there are budget bills. The budget bills have a lot more numbers than regular bills. So each state department has its own budget bill, and that goes through a process. The Missouri General Assembly has a constitutional deadline to complete the budget, and it is the only thing they are constitutionally required to do when they meet. So if the Missouri General Assembly met in January, finished the budget by its constitutional deadline, and adjourned and did nothing else, that would be absolutely fine. They're required to do it, and they're required to make it balanced, which means they can't spend more money than we're bringing in. So the budget process actually starts far before they ever go into legislative session. So in the summer and through October, the state departments are working on scenarios, they're working on requests from the budget office, they're working on their requests that go to the governor. So the state departments lift that up to the governor's office, and then the budget process starts with the governor. So in January, the governor releases an executive budget. He says, here's how I would spend the $52 billion of this state. Here's my idea. And then following that, he kind of doesn't have anything else to do with the process officially until the very end again. So then it gets handed off to the House Budget Committee and its appropriations subcommittees, and the budget bills are filed officially by the chair of the House Budget Committee. So they file those bills, they have hearings, they have state departments come and walk through the budget books, talk to them about all of the different programs, what the outcomes are, who they serve, what the intention is. And they do that across the entirety of the budget, which can be 17 or 19 different budget bills, and they are extensive. So the members of those committees get to know a little bit about a lot of things. And so that's one of the reasons it's so important for advocates to have relationships and conversations with their legislators, because we assume they know exactly how they're spending this money, who the services are being provided to, why, what the intent is, what the value is, but oftentimes they don't. They just get a little snippet of that. After the House finishes its work with the budget, the Senate does the same thing. The Senate Appropriations Committee has those same presentations, has public hearings, moves through their process. Both the House and the Senate have to pass budget bills. They are always different. So when we talk about the legislative process and those conference committees, in the legislative process, sometimes the House accepts the Senate's changes. They're like, yeah, that's fine, we'll do that. There's almost always conference committees related to the appropriations bills, and there's some negotiation that happens there. The conference committee is made up, remember, of House members and Senate members. And then they come to an agreement on a compromise. It goes back to the House and Senate for their vote, and then it goes on to the governor. And the governor gets to hang out with the budget bills for a little bit. He's actually not required to sign them until June 30th, which is wild because the fiscal year starts July 1st. So sometimes if there are any changes made by the governor, because once it gets back to the governor, remember, he started the process and said, here's my executive budget recommendations, here's what I think we should do. And then the House and Senate all have their say, and then he gets the budget again. and gets to take action on it. So he gets to do something that he doesn't actually get to do when we're talking about bills and legislation. He gets to line item veto budget items or withhold funding on some of those budget items. So he gets to say, oh, Kathy's potato farm got $10 million. I only wanted to give her 8. So maybe I'm gonna withhold the additional 2, or maybe I'm gonna line item veto that. Or, Kathy really made me mad because now she's gonna make French fries instead of potato chips, and I don't like that at all. I'm gonna veto the whole $10 million. Kathy's potato farm is out on the street. So the governor can make decisions related to line items in the state's budget, and what he gets from the General Assembly is often different than what he proposed. So they take some time going over that. And this particular governor has traditionally exercised his right to withhold dollars. Now, when he withholds dollars, he could release them sometime over the course of the 12-month fiscal year. So he might say, I don't actually know if we're going to be able to give Kathy's Potato Farm $10 million. Let's see how revenues come in for the first quarter. And if it's looking good, if it's looking like we'll have enough money, I'll release that $2 million. Okay. But if it's vetoed, it's gone forever. You can't get it back unless the General Assembly overrides that veto. And I would say that that is extremely rare, particularly in this climate. We have a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and the governor is of that same party. So it would be very likely that they would have an all-out battle and they would override a veto of the governor. So $52 billion, that's a lot of money. Oh my gosh. It is. However, when we're talking about the General Assembly and what they actually get to decide related to the budget, it turns out it's a lot smaller than that. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the total budget, all funds. This is the $52 billion. This is the big number. A lot of those are federal funds. That big green half of the pie, those are federal funds. Then you have other funds. Then the blue part that's broken out is the general revenue. So this is the money that the state brings in, and they get to decide where some of that goes. Some of that goes. So the second pie piece shows you mandatories and education mandatories. So it is already decided how some of that money has to be spent, either because it's statutory or constitutional, or for a variety of other reasons. We have to spend that money that way, which leaves this little piece that's discretionary, that light blue piece. And then it goes into that even smaller, about $3-4 billion, where the Missouri General Assembly really can decide to increase or decrease spending. So when we think about the budget process and we think about, oh, they have $52 billion, like certainly they can move things around. They're working with a very much smaller percentage of that than people realize. And that's where services for people with disabilities live, in that small circle all the way to the right of your screen that the General Assembly gets to decide about. So when they did that this year, let's talk about what happened. I'd be surprised if many of you didn't already know this. It's kind of a big deal. When the governor released his executive budget recommendations in January, he recommended cuts in services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, particularly in 2 programs: in rehabilitation services, or day services, which allow a person that doesn't necessarily have a vocational goal to have a value day, maybe to volunteer, to get out into their community, to do things that they enjoy, to make connections and relationships, and to give back. The other program targeted by the governor was reductions in rates. And a rate is what the government pays per quarter hour, per hour for that service in self-directed services. So self-directed services are those services where a family hires and fires their own staff, has control over that. They're the employer with some additional support. It's a really, really important program that's been growing steadily in Missouri since it was first introduced. And it's So the governor said, we want to spend less money here and we want to spend less money here. And subsequently, in both the House and the Senate, that funding was restored. So they said, actually, we don't think we want to cut there. We're going to put that money back in. We're going to take it from somewhere else. There's some additional House and Senate differences when talking about the budget. So the House had no new waiver slots. So if you're familiar, Medicaid waiver provides for things like residential services. There are a variety of waivers in the state that people with developmental disabilities access for their services. And the House said, you can't have any more. We're not serving any new people, no additional waiver slots. And the Senate said, yeah, we're going to do the same thing the House did. We're going to restore the funding that the governor recommended cutting, but we are going to add new waiver slots. So we're going to be able to serve some new people, limited amount. And then in conference committee, they split the difference. So they went not 100, not 0. They went right in the middle to 50. And then we are currently awaiting governor action on those items. And what can the governor do? He can veto or he can withhold. So it is still unknown whether or not those items will survive the entirety of the budget making process, because the governor has until June 30th to take his action on the budget. So what happened? Like, the governor said, we're going to cut these services, and the General Assembly said, no, we're not going to do that. The answer is actually quite simple. That middle part in those photos show you what happened between the governor's recommendations and the truly agreed and finally passed budget. Families impacted by the potential cuts in self-directed services and in day services absolutely rallied rapidly to educate legislators, to ask them for their help, to make it really clear how important these services are to their family and to their loved one and to themselves. So people spoke out. I was not in the Capitol one day this past legislative session where I did not see people advocating for day services and self-directed supports. So people rallied, they came, and they garnered the support of legislators, and it worked. And the legislators said, you know, you're right. We don't want to have to touch that. And then the services were restored. Now, whether the governor will have that same perspective and state of mind is yet to be determined, but I think that the actions of this legislative session just underscore the importance and effectiveness of advocacy and self-advocacy when we're talking about services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Some legislators had no idea. You know, they may have a farm in Pemiscot County and may not even know a person with a developmental disability. So it's a whole new world to them. We have other legislators who have family members, maybe a child, maybe a cousin or an aunt or an uncle with a disability. And so they may be a little bit more familiar, but, you know, the education done around this was extensive. I think you would be hard pressed to find a member of the Budget or Appropriations Committee who does not know what both of these services are, what they do, how much we spend, and how important they are to families. So big congratulations to all of the families and individuals with disabilities who made their voices heard this legislative session. And it was a really important thing to do because it may not be getting any better. So I want to talk a little bit about the future. Okay, so the budget in Missouri has been growing. So it didn't always used to be $52 billion. Like years and years ago in another life, I was an intern at the Missouri State Senate and the budget was $24 billion. And I thought that was the biggest number I had ever conceived of in my entire life. And now we sit at about $52, $53 billion. And you'll see in this chart, the blue part is the state funds, the federal money, and the green part is that federal stimulus money. So you can see right where that takes off, right? In the COVID times in 2020, the federal government pushed out all these dollars, which is absolutely needed, very generous and utilized. And we have still been spending them, but they're almost gone. So the kind of artificial inflation of the entirety of the state's budget is about to kind of correct itself. So the budget has been growing and will shrink. This is a snippet from the budget director's guidance to the state departments. Talks about shortfalls in the upcoming budget year, $1 billion shortfall starting in fiscal year 27 if correction isn't made. And throughout the entirety of the budget making process, the continued narrative was, and it's going to get worse, right? So legislators anticipate having to continue to reduce the number of dollars they spend on their portion of the budget that they can have control over. Here's some other things looking ahead that are coming. We're going to have an election in November. 39 of the 163 House members will turn over. We have term limits in Missouri. Those people have served their time that they're allowed in that body and are not eligible for re-election. So at minimum, we're going to have 39 new House members, and we're going to have 10 new senators out of 34. 10 doesn't seem like a lot, when it is just about a third of that decision-making body. That really is a lot. So, for advocates who were able to connect with House members and get them to be highly educated, that is always an ongoing process because you always have new people coming in, right? New potato farmer from Pemiscot County who doesn't know anything about these services needs to be educated. In addition, HJR 173 coming up on the August or November ballot. There's a bunch of stuff that's going to be on that ballot in November, particularly. There's going to be changes in initiative petition processes. It's going to be a soil and water conservation tax. It's going to be a change in Jackson County assessor process, how they either get elected or appointed. There's a creation of a sovereign wealth fund for the state to make investments with some of its money, and there will likely be more things. So, bring a folding chair with you when you go in November to vote to fill out your ballot because it could be a long one. And there will be lots and lots of issues that will require people to learn about those before they make their decision. In addition, we have redistricting. I put an asterisk and I said this could have its own webinar because it's kind of a mess. The General Assembly did off-year redistricting, and then there was a challenge about whether or not they could. And now there's some additional lawsuits and there's some confusion about whether or not the new map is going to go into effect in August or November and all of those kinds of things. So, that's congressional district redistricting. And so that's something else that is probably going to take up a lot of time, attention, and process in the state of Missouri. We still have many years into the future of HR 1, or what some people call the Big Beautiful Bill, and the implementation of that. So that legislation passed and then had lots of things that were going to roll out over time, right? That could include people having to reauthorize their Medicaid eligibility every 6 months instead of every year, and a variety of other changes that are going to come that might mean either the state has to spend more money to be in compliance, or we might lose some additional federal funding. So all of the analysis of HR 1 shows that it'll reduce eligible Medicaid beneficiaries, and it will cost states revenue. So, there are a lot of triggers in the upcoming years related to that that'll impact the state's budget. And then upcoming budget cycles, just that continued reduction of some of those federal dollars and an uncertain future related to Missouri's general revenue that comes in. Because if you eliminate the source of 60% of our general revenue, then we're not exactly sure what that might look like, how it might get replaced, if it might get replaced, or if it might just shrink the revenue of the state going forward. These are just some examples, not only from Missouri, but in other states where states are grappling with the same kinds of budget issues, and people with disabilities and their families are fighting back against potential reductions in those services. And here's one from Missouri. Still more might be coming. The General Assembly this year, the governor recommended more than $600 million in reductions. The General Assembly actually ended up cutting more than that, even though the services that we cared deeply about were restored in the General Assembly's budget, they cut in other places. Next legislative session, it's anticipated they may have to cut more. That might be up to $2 billion. So like I said, we do have to continue to help our legislators understand how important it is to prioritize services for people with developmental disabilities. I invite you, if you are not already signed up, to receive our legislative update. It's called the Easterseals Advocacy Brief. If you go to our website, midwest.easterseals.com, and go to Take Action, you can visit our advocacy page. Once you're on our advocacy page, you can find something that looks like the screen on the left-hand side, which is Visit the Advocacy Action Center. There you can find our past advocacy briefs. You can sign up for alerts. You can find your legislator and a variety of other information that can better help you advocate. Now, I'm going to pop into the Q&A, which I do not see any questions currently in the Q&A. I do see a question, does HB 1840 only attach the designation to the driver's license or extend it to the vehicle registration? I'll have to check on that. I think that some of those details may be to be determined depending on the form that the department creates in order to fulfill the provisions of that legislation. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Anybody else have a question? You can feel free to put it in the chat, which I have open. We also have Q&A. Do I follow federal legislation impacting IDD as well? Yes, we at Easterseals do. We are part of a national network of Easterseals affiliates who does federal legislative work, as well as we are members of several national organizations like ANCOR and others that follow federal legislation. I can't give you a federal legislative update right now, though, because we only have 6 minutes. Any other questions, either in the chat or in the Q&A? If you think of one later, I can always be reached at advocacy@esmw.org. Again, I encourage you to check out some of the materials on our website, and we will be following up with all registrants with a link to this recorded webinar, as well as the slide deck. May also give you a brief survey so you can help us help you better. And I invite any and all of you to join me in doing some advocacy before the General Assembly goes back in January. Someone asked me if now things are really slow because the General Assembly is not in session, and I said it absolutely should not be. The busiest time for advocacy should be when legislators are at home, when they're not dealing with the distraction of what's happening in the Capitol, and building those relationships now, because the worst time to make a friend is the moment you need them. So if they know you, know your issue, know what's important to you, and then you can follow up when they're in Jefferson City working on these things, that is a far superior strategy than making a call or sending an email in the middle of legislative session when your legislator has no idea who you are. So ideally, we'll be building a lot of relationships over the course of the interim before legislative session starts again. Again, I'm Kathy Brown. Thank you for joining us at Easterseals for this advocacy brief. Please keep an eye out for more opportunities to engage with us in advocacy and continue to learn. Thank you for everything that you do and your interest in making the world better for people with disabilities. Have a great day.